The committee should come to order. We are meeting today to consider one bill, including postponed votes. The bill has been properly noticed and circulated electronically along with copies of timely filed amendment and is on the committee repository at docs.house.gov. Pursuant to committee rules, members of the committee may submit written opening statements for the record, and I ask that members may revise and extend the remarks on the bills to be considered at this markup and have those remarks included in the record without objection. So ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Pursuant to Committee Rule 3I and House Rule 11, Clause 2, I announce that I may postpone proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote or the ayes and nays are ordered. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones, and members can only be muted to avoid inadvertent background noise. Members experiencing any technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. And at this point, Mr. Westerman, do you wish to be recognized for any opening statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And good morning. Mr. Chairman, I believe our committee is capable of multitasking. We have to do that oftentimes in our service here in Congress. And we can conduct our markups and our legislative business while still making time to hear from administration officials and carry out the very necessary congressional oversight that this committee needs to be carrying out. However, if you look at our schedule this year, you'll see the exact opposite has been true. The committee has often held just one markup per month, which is a drastic contrast to the 116th Congress, where we were one of the most active committees on the Hill. Now, because last week's debate ran long, that somehow prevents us from hearing from Secretary Holland today. Just this morning, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, of which me and several others in here sit on that committee, they convened an early morning markup before immediately proceeding to a full committee oversight hearing. And I have to ask myself, why then does one item of business of this committee keep us from conducting another? We could have easily dispensed with the delayed votes and then begin our hearing with Secretary Holland. There's no reason for this not taking place. It's not uncommon for other committees to go long into the night voting on amendments at markup. We could have finished our business last week and left plenty of time for Secretary Holland this week. Or better yet, how about we bring members back in the committee room and make the votes go much faster so that we could dispense with votes in a much quicker and shorter amount of time. With limited legislative days remaining in Congress, it's imperative that we hear from Secretary Holland soon. All our members, regardless of party affiliations, deserve the chance to listen to her testimony firsthand and conduct oversight on this administration's policies. Mr. Chair, I look forward to and I really hope that you will reschedule Secretary Holland's hearing in November. I think anything less than that is an abdication of our duty as representatives, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westerman. Let me agree with you on one point that I hope we will look and we're looking and to schedule a date in the future, in the work period, for the secretary, for her to come before the committee and us have an opportunity to speak with her, and that's in the works. But today's agenda, I might add, is a direct result of how the minority chose to spend its time. And with that, let me return to the unfinished business. The item for consideration is HR 4690, offered by Representative Huffman. The subcommittee has already been discharged from further consideration, and the bill has already been read and made open for amendment at any point. We have completed general debate. The amendment in the nature of the substitute offered by myself has already been deemed as read and open to amendment at any point. We have considered and debated some 35 amendments to the ANS. Seeing no further amendments, we will return now to the previously requested votes. Let me begin with The question is on the amendments to the ANS. The amendment is designated Whitman number 1. The clerk shall read the names of, the clerk shall call the roll, please.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Costa?
No, I think petition. So no.
Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Whitman?
Aye.
Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves?
Yes.
Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin? Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes no. Mr. Webster, can you repeat? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon?
Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Ms. Leger Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Ms. Stansberry? Mr. Stauber? Aye. Mr. Stauber votes aye.
Dan's no.
This is, if you could flip it, yes. If not, we'll get out of here. We'll get out. Thank you, sir.
Note the amendment natures of substance.
Can we give us 1 second?
Can you, Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany?
Tiffany, aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velazquez?
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velazquez votes no. Mr. Carl?
Yes.
Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Lee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee, I do not have a visual.
Can you see me now?
Ms. Brownlee, I do not have a visual.
Costa votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Costa votes no.
All right, I gotcha.
Ms. Brownlee, you're not recorded?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell?
Okay.
Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
Hopefully. Yeah.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Mrs. Boebert? Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCollum. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
Talib, no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Madam Clerk, Boebert votes yes.
Ms. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Levin votes no.
Are there any members who wish to vote and are not recorded or to change their vote? Hearing none, the vote is closed and the clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 14 and the nays are 21.
The amendment fails. We move now to amendment designated Whitman number 3, and the clerk shall please call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva.
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman.
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
Oh.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert. Mr. Costa. Mr. Costa, can you repeat, please?
No.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn. Mr. Sablon. Mr. Woodman. Mr. Woodman votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter.
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Ms. Leger Fernandez. Mr. Fulcher. Ms. Stansberry. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velazquez.
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velazquez votes no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
Stansbury votes no.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore.
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle.
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Mrs. Boebert.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCollum. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Tonko.
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
Talib, no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Leger Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no.
Are there any members who are not recorded and wish to vote and, or
Gomert
change their
votes.
vote?
Gomert votes aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye.
Hearing no one else, the vote is closed, and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 15 and the nays are 21.
The amendment fails. Mr. Westerman, you wish to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under Committee Rule 5C, I give notice of my intention to file additional or dissenting views on the bill just considered and all bills considered during this markup, and I ask unanimous consent that this notice be extended to all members. I yield back.
It's ordered. Thank you, and now we move to amendment designated Bent's number 8, and the clerk shall please call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
Aye.
Mr. Costa votes aye. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablan? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss? Mr. Neguse? Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster?
Neguse votes no.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Leger Fernandez? Mr. Fulcher? Ms. Stansberry? Mr. Stauber?
Ledger Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola?
Stansberry votes no.
Mrs. Peltola votes no. Ms. Stansberry votes no. Ms. Stansberry, do not have a visual.
Stansberry votes no.
Thank you. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velasquez?
Alaska votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Carl? Yes. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
Get votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Mrs. Boebert?
Robert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye.
Is your phone ready for
Mr.
me? Was
Soto.
you able to-
It's ready to be.
Soto votes no.
Okay.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCullum? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Any other member wish to be recorded that's not recorded?
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye.
Radewagen. Radewagen, aye.
Mrs. Radewagen votes aye.
Anyone else? Hearing none, the vote is closed. The clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 20.
The amendment fails, and we move to the amendment designated Westerman number 1. Clerk, please.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablon?
Got cut out, so they didn't get it.
Mr. Whitman? Aye. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? No. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego?
No, I missed it. I wasn't on.
Yeah,
Mr. Heiss?
voice at the.
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen?
Radawagon, aye.
Mrs. Radewagen votes aye. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Leger Fernandez? Mr. Fulcher? Ms. Stansberry? Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velasquez?
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no.
And-
Mr. Carl?
Stansbury votes no as well.
Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. Stansberry votes no.
Gonzalez
Costa.
Colon votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa, you've already been recorded. You are voted as a no. Ms. Deget?
Okay.
DeGette votes no.
Ms. Deget votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Hill votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin, I do not have a visual.
All right, let me see if you got one now.
Yes, sir. Mr. McEachin votes
McEachin
no.
votes no.
Mrs. Bobert?
Robert votes aye.
Mrs. Bobert votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCollum? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Tonko?
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Leger Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Recorded, wish to record their vote?
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
How is Mr. McClintock recorded?
Mr. McClintock is not recorded.
McClintock votes aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye.
How is Mr. Cohen recorded?
Mr. Cohen is not recorded.
Mr. Cohen wants to vote aye. No, excuse me. No, I want to vote no. But I
Mr.
do want to vote.
Mr. Cohen, I do not
So
have
I
a
wanted to
visual,
vote
sir.
with aye, but my vote will be no.
Mr. Cohen, I do not have a visual.
That was a good tap
You don't
dance.
have a visual. How about start my video. There we go.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Cohen votes no.
Mr. Westerman, sometimes the case is made for you for on-site participation. But anyway,
I don't know if you want to.
anyone else not recorded? Hearing none, the vote is closed, and the clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 23.
Move to the amendment designated Westerman number 2. The clerk should please call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
No.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablan? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Mr. Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radawagon?
Radawagon, aye.
Mrs. Radawagon votes aye. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon?
Aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Ms. Leger Fernandez? Mr. Fulcher? Ms. Stansberry? Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola?
Stansbury votes no.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velazquez?
Vasquez votes no.
Ms. Velazquez votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Engel votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
Is the way that the
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCullum? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Tonko?
Tonko votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Leave no.
Ms. Talib
Leger
votes,
Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no.
Any members not recorded wish to record their vote?
Congressman Cohen,
How's Mr. Cohen?
Mr. Cohen is not recorded.
I'm trying to get there's my video. I want to vote no.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Mr. Chairman,
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Mr. Chairman,
Sir?
Fulcher votes aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye.
Thank you.
I found out I got there. You don't have to go to the White House.
If there's no one else, the vote is closed and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 19 and the nays are 23.
The amendment fails. We move to amendment designated Westerman number 11. The clerk shall call the roll, please.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye, matey.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
Mr. votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablan? Mr. Woodman?
No.
Mr. Woodman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr.
No,
Huffman
no.
votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal
We're
votes
on.
no.
Voting, so, okay.
I'll take these so that they're not confusing.
Yeah.
Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen?
Rattlewagon, aye.
Mrs. Radewagen votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon? Ms. Leger Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velasquez?
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
It votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes no.
Mr. McEachin votes no. Mrs. Bobert?
Bobert votes aye.
Mrs. Bobert votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia is a no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCullum? Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr.
No.
Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Echo votes no.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib, no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Any members not recorded wish to record their vote?
Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye.
Anyone else? If not, vote is closed. Clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 19 and the nays are 23.
The amendment fails. We move to amendment designated Rosendale number 2. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
No. Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablan? Mr. Woodman? Mr. Woodman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Aye, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Neguse? Mrs. Radewagen?
Rattlewagon, aye.
Mrs. Radewagen votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes aye. Ms. Porter?
Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon?
Aye.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes aye. Ms. Leger Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velazquez?
Velasquez votes no.
Mr. Velazquez votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
It votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Ingold, no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia's a no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCullum? Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
No.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded? This is Mr. Neguse.
Mr. Neguse is not recorded.
Neguse votes no.
Mr. Neguse votes no.
Any other member wish to have their vote recorded that's not? Sir? How's Mr. Graves recorded?
Mr. Graves is recorded as a, yes. Mr. Graves votes no.
Anyone else? If not, the vote is closed, and the clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 23.
The amendment fails. We now move to amendment designated Bent's number 5. The clerk shall please call the roll.
Mr. Chair, the vote totals for the amendment designated Bent's number 8 to the ANS were announced incorrectly as 20 ayes and 18 nays. The correct totals were 21 ayes and 18 nays. The correct totals are reflected on the clerk's tally sheet. The outcome is not affected.
Where are we going to? Bent's? The clerk shall please call the roll. Bent's designate number 5?
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
No.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes yes. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Heiss votes yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yea. Ms. Porter?
No. Porter votes no.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon?
Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes yes. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
Leger Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansbury? Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velazquez?
Stansbury votes no.
Ms. Stansbury votes no.
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velazquez votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette?
DeGette votes no.
Ms. DeGette votes no. Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye. My camera's pulling up. Boebert votes aye.
Thank you. Ms. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCollum? Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Leave no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Any members which are not recorded that wish to record their vote? If not, vote is closed, and the clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 22.
Amendment fails. We move to amendment designated Carl 13. And the clerk shall please call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
Oh.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes yes. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Heiss, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Nagoose?
No.
Mr. Nagoose votes no. Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yes. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon?
Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes yes. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
I'm sorry, Ms. Stansberry, I don't have a visual.
Stansbury votes no.
Thank you very much. Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Ms. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velasquez?
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes yes. Ms. DeGette? Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mrs. Boebert? Mr. Soto?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes aye. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCollum? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Leave no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Any members not recorded that wish to be recorded? Hearing none, the vote is closed, and the clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 20.
The amendment fails, and we now move to amendment designated Tiffany 4. Clerk, please.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
No.
Costa
votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lambourne? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes yes. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Aye, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radwagon? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yes. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon?
Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes yes. Ms. Leger-Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Leger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry?
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velasquez?
Alaska votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, I.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee?
Miss Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mrs. Boebert? Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Mr. Garcia?
Garcia votes no.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCollum? Mr. Cohen?
No.
I'm sorry, Mr. Cohen, I don't have a visual.
You don't see a visual.
I do not, sir.
I'm working on it.
Thank you very
There,
much, sir.
well,
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
Right. Thank you.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye.
How is Talib recorded?
Ms. Talib is not recorded.
Talib, no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Any members not recorded wish to do so? If not, the vote is closed, and the clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 21.
The amendment fails, and we move to amendment designated Rosendale number 1. The clerk shall please call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
The bottom of the sheet. No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lambourne? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes yes. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radwagon? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yea. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes yes. Ms. Leisure Fernandez. Mr. Fulcher.
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansberry.
No.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle.
Votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin. Mrs. Boebert.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Soto.
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes yes. Ms. Conway. Excuse me, Mr. Garcia.
Garcia votes no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway. Mr. Case.
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCollum. Mr. Cohen.
No. But video will come up in just a moment. Come on, video. Start my video.
There we go.
We are. No.
Thank you. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko.
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib.
No.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Leisure Fernandez votes no.
Ms. Leisure Fernandez votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how is Mr. Whitman recorded?
Mr. The clerk? How,
Mr. Whitman is recorded as a yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any member not recorded wish to do so? If not, the vote is closed, and the clerk shall please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 21.
The amendment fails. And now we move to amendment designated Stauber number 3. Clerk shall please call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva.
No.
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman.
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert.
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa.
Costa votes no.
Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lambourne. Mr. Sablan. Mr. Whitman. Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal.
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes yes. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Heiss.
Aye, yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse.
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radawagon. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster. Mr. Webster votes yes. Ms. Porter.
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez Colon.
Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon votes yes. Ms. Leisure Fernandez.
No.
Ms. Leisure Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher.
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mrs. Stansberry.
Stansberry votes no.
Ms. Stansberry votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velasquez.
Velasquez votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mr. Rosendale.
Rosendale, aye.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Mr. Moore.
Ms. Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle.
Dingle votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell. Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin. Mrs. Boebert.
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Soto.
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte. Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas. Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Garcia.
Garcia, no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway. Mr. Case.
No. No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCullum? Mr. Cohen?
Mr. Cohen?
Mr. Cohen?
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib, no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Any member wish to be recorded? That's not. Hearing none, vote is closed. Clerk should please report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 21.
The amendment fails, and we move to amendment designated graves number 15.
Mr. Chairman,
Sir,
asking that consensus.
on 15? Okay. Without objection? Now we move to amendment designated graves number 8. Clerk, so please call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
No?
Mr. Grijalva votes no. Mr. Westerman?
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Costa? I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please, Mr. Costa?
Costa votes no.
Thank you. Mr. Costa votes no. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes no.
Mr. Lowenthal votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes yes. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Heiss?
Yes.
Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Mrs. Radawagon? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes yes. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon?
Yes.
Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes yes. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez?
No.
Ms. Ledger-Fernandez votes no. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's aye.
Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Ms. Stansbury?
Stansbury votes no.
Ms. Stansbury votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mrs. Peltola? Ms. Peltola votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Ms. Velasquez?
Oscar votes no.
Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Carl? Mr. Carl votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, no.
Mr. Rosendale votes no. Ms. Brownlee?
Miss Brownlee votes no.
Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Moore?
Aye.
Mr. Moore votes aye. Mrs. Dingle?
Engel votes no.
Mrs. Dingle votes no. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes aye. Mr. McEachin? Mrs. Boebert?
Boebert votes aye.
Mrs. Boebert votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes no.
Mr. Soto, I'm sorry, I don't have a visual.
Soto
There we
votes
go.
no.
Thank you very much. Mr. Soto votes no. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes aye. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes no. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes yes. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia, no.
Mr. Garcia votes no. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
No.
Mr. Case votes no. Ms. McCullum? Mr. Cohen?
Mr. Cohen votes no, and Mr. Soto, I've got an extra razor.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Tonko?
No.
Mr. Tonko votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib, no.
Ms. Talib votes no.
Any members not recorded?
Mr. Chair,
Yes?
how's Rosendale recorded, please?
Clerk? How's the gentleman recorded?
Mr. Rosendale's recorded as a no.
Rosendale, aye, please.
Mr. Rosendale votes aye.
Anyone else? Hearing none, vote is closed, and the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 18 and the nays are 21.
The amendment fails. Before we move to the question on the ANS as amended to HR 4690, let me just take a quick second to acknowledge Mr. Soto from Florida, Mr. Webster from Florida, and extend to them and the constituents that they represent our prayers and the efforts to make sure that first that the participation of the federal government is solid and that the people that have been harmed and will be harmed going forward, that they have the support. And we extend that and our prayers to them, as to Mr. Soto, who is in Florida right now, and also to our colleague, Ms. Velasquez and Ms. Gonzalez Colon, same situation in Puerto Rico. And that oversight hearing is something that I hope we can schedule during the lame duck to get an assessment as to what has happened and what has not happened and what needs to happen. And it was difficult to get the appropriate federal agencies in front of us for that kind of a discussion, given the fact that they're responding to two major natural catastrophes right now. So to our colleagues, our best to you and to your communities. And we now move to the MSA reauthorization, HR 4690, as amended. All those in favor say, indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes overwhelmingly have it, and the ANS is agreed to as amended, and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The question is on adopting HR 4690 as amended, order in favor, reported to the House. All those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is adopted as amended.
Mr. Chairman, we request the yeas and nays.
A recorded vote has been requested, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Grijalva?
Aye.
Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Westerman?
No.
Mr. Westerman votes no. Mrs. Napolitano?
Aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
No.
Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Costa?
Costa votes aye.
Mr. Costa votes aye. Mr. Lamborn? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Whitman? Mr. Whitman votes no. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Lowenthal?
Lowenthal votes aye.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Gallego? Mr. Gallego votes aye. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes no. Mr. Neguse? I'm sorry, Mr. Neguse, can you please repeat that?
Aye. Neguse votes aye.
Thank you. Mr. Neguse votes aye. Mrs. Radewagen? Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster votes no. Ms. Porter?
Yes.
Ms. Porter votes yes. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon? Ms. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Ms. Leisure-Fernandez?
Yes.
Ms. Leisure-Fernandez votes yes. Mr. Fulcher?
Fulcher's no.
Mr. Fulcher votes no. Ms. Stansberry?
Aye.
Ms. Stansberry votes aye. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes no. Mrs. Peltola? Mrs. Peltola votes yes. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Ms. Velasquez?
Velasquez votes aye.
Ms. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Carl? No. Mr. Carl votes no. Ms. DeGette? Mr. Rosendale?
Rosendale, no.
Mr. Rosendale votes no. Mrs. Brownlee?
Ms. Brownlee votes aye.
Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Moore? No. Mr. Moore votes no. Mrs. Dingle?
Engel votes aye.
Mrs. Dingle votes aye. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell votes no. Mr. McEachin? Mrs. Boebert?
Robert votes no.
Mrs. Boebert votes no. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye. Mr. Obernolte? Mr. Obernolte votes no. Mr. San Nicolas? Mr. San Nicolas votes yes. Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Garcia?
Garcia is an aye.
Mr. Garcia votes aye. Ms. Conway? Mr. Case?
Aye.
Mr. Case votes aye. Ms. McCullum? Mr. Cohen. Mr. Tonko.
Aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Talib.
Talib, aye.
Ms. Talib votes aye.
Any member wish to be recorded? That's not? Hearing none, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 18.
The ayes have it, and the bill is adopted as amended and ordered favorably reported, and the motion to reconsider on the table. Mr. Westerman, do you have any regarding views? No? No. Before we get to the closing part of it and everybody leaves, while I'm talking to myself here, I want to take the time to extend our appreciation and to Chairman Huffman, Mr. Case, the ranking member, for their work on the bill. It's been a difficult process, and so congratulations to you, sir. And with that, all members shall have 2 days in which to file supplemental, additional, minority, or dissenting views. And I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bill ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. I also ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered reported with an amendment to strike out all after the enacting clause and insert the text of the bill with its perfecting amendments adopted in committee. Without objection, so ordered. I want to thank Ranking Member Westerman, the other members of the committee, for moving this markup along. And if there's no further business, meeting's adjourned, and thank all of you very much.